Welcome all to empoweringlearners.ai. This is the industry perspectives on learning and analytics and AI and K-12 education. We have a terrific panel here from Colin Wood from Verso, Ralph Saubern from ACER, Rowan Freeman from Intellischool, and Richard Wilson from Math Pathways. Thank you all for coming along and attending. Today we're going to really be giving a industry's perspective, but on the whole of data, not just AI, and trying to draw a lens that draws from the use of data in K-12 through to how industry utilizes data, and then the opportunities that come from wider use of machine learning that can impact learning and the overall efficiencies in education. So one of the contexts I want to give is that K-12 has a long history in using evidence and measurement. And so, if you like, we're well versed in data, but it's a very specific data. It's used for international comparability. It's a small set of metrics that holds policy in a large way across what we view as progress. And it's meant that we're even at a point where with our learning analytics that exists, we can create predictions of students' ATAR with a fairly good level of confidence, all things being equal. So as long as we don't do better or worse, we kind of know how a lot of the curves and predictions in our standard set of metrics are going to occur. However, everyone on this call believes that we can actually impact that. That's why we're involved in education. And it's a combination of unlocking the data to inform functionality that can actually give us innovation. And that innovation, and you'll hear this multiple times from me today, that innovation can't happen in isolation. In a digital world, it is the connections between all the data that provides us the opportunities for sets of insights that exist and are yet to be unlocked. So with that overview and introduction, I'd like to let each of the participants tell us a bit about themselves, what their products do, and what they think is the industry's view from their perspective. So I'm just going to go down the list in order and let Colin, you tell us a bit about Verso and what you're doing.
Perfect, thanks Dan. Colin Wood from Verso Learning. I guess our business is built on the premise that teachers can have the biggest impact on student learning. And therefore what we do is we help schools and systems collect data through a student check-in. But what we do with machine learning is we interpret that feedback to help teachers and school leaders close the gap between perception and reality. So, we think that lesson went well, the students think they got it. We look at that feedback and see what it was they were there to get, and how they might have got it and how well they did. And so by closing that gap, we empower teachers to make rapid adjustments to their practice and I guess with a goal to significantly increase impact in the classroom.
Thank you, Colin. Wow, that was a much faster than I was expecting you to go through. All right, Ralph.
Thanks, Dan. My name is Ralph Saubern. I'm Deputy CEO at the Australian Council for Educational Research. For our international participants, because the Australian Council for Educational Research is a mouthful, in Australia we often say ACER, not to be confused, apologies if you're disappointed, not to be confused with the computer manufacturing company ACER. So we say ACER. ACER is predominantly a research institute, so you may be asking why I'm part of this panel. We are predominantly a research institute, but we are a research institute that has a very applied viewpoint, and we work considerably within K-12 as well as pre-K and in tertiary settings to with educational decision makers in classrooms at institute level, at system level, to provide research-based products and services that support their work. And Dan started by saying that we are going to focus around the ideas of evidence, data, information. That is something that ACER has at its core. Our work is predominantly around helping educational decision makers, whether those are teachers or school leaders or system managers or academics or others, to make good decisions based on good evidence. So we have a number of services that are based on our research that go directly into schools and are used extensively in schools, particularly assessment tools. So these are tools that the teachers and school leaders can use to gather evidence about student learning, which they can then use to inform their teaching and learning practice. That's probably enough, Dan.
No, thank you, Ralph. Rowan, tell us about yourself and Intellischool.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Rowan Freeman. I'm head of product for Intellischool. We are chiefly a data aggregation and data visualization company working exclusively in K-12 in schools. And what that means is we're helping schools pull in the various data sources that you commonly see in schools, like a learning management system, an information system, some of the external standardized tests that Ralph's just mentioned. A really common one as well, in addition to that, is NAPLAN and other systems as well, where schools find it really complicated to be able to pull all of that together to be able to draw insights and learn, what can we tell about our students and their progress from all of these different signals around performance and aptitude. And then once we've unified all of that data, we start to build data visualizations that are chiefly concerned with the kinds of actions that we think help support teachers' work. We feel like the classroom teacher is our true customer. We want to build everything with them in mind and the kinds of actions and activities that they do in their classroom. And we feel like everything that we do around information design, the timeliness of information, how that information is delivered, so where it's delivered, is it, we tend to work through our partners, so making sure that all the decisions we make around those different aspects of data visualization suit the classroom teacher. I thought I might start with some views on machine learning. Dan pointed to some of the issues that we experience in K-12, and we feel them fairly closely as we're a data aggregation company rather than a data creation company. So when we're pulling from multiple data sources to try and complete a picture for a school, we inherit from those different data sources and the data sources that schools create themselves, the inconsistencies in data collection, the data scarcity that comes with those different data sources. So one of the challenges that we experience is in any kind of model development for machine learning is sort of hindered by those issues. And the other that I want to point out really early on here is where we have seen some models or an interest in some models in schools is we're always really cautious in that we want to see that there is a hypothesis in place. If you collect this information, you present this information, what actions or outcomes do you anticipate will come of it? What do you want to see change? So this is one of the things that we always want to see around model development. And the other is, trying to avoid this notion of algorithmic black boxes. We want to make sure that where there are algorithms in place, that it is easy to understand what they're doing. It is easy to be able to work with the school to make changes to the way that it works, but chiefly knowing or having some impression of what's going on under the hood is really important to us. And I think, that's probably enough for me as an intro.
Thank you, Rowan. And last but not least, Richard Wilson from Math Pathways.
Thanks, Dan. So yeah, my name is Richard. I'm a co-founder of Maths Pathway. I came out of classroom teaching originally. I was an end user for a bunch of tools, and then I turned out to become a guy who makes tools. So I don't know what that says. But Maths Pathway is essentially a learning and teaching model for mathematics. So we have a slightly different bent on all of this because we're very domain specific. And I think there are really specific differences in the different domains of learning and teaching in terms of how they best use data, how they best use machine learning and AI. It's always interesting to explore the differences between things that involve, say, free text and assessment around that versus, assessing computational thinking in a child's work, for example. They're very different problems to try and analyze. The work that we do is quite opinionated from a curriculum point of view, I guess. So we produce the entire curriculum activity course that a school will use to teach their mathematics. Obviously, it's deployed by teachers in different ways, and some of it's online and some of it's offline. But really, a lot of our use of data comes both in the kind of automation side for students. So we do a lot around personalized learning and working out what's most appropriate for a student to learn next. And again, we're trying to take a lot of that, I think like Colin said, that gap between the perception and the reality of what a student needs to learn next can be quite wide. And so we try and use as much transparent data as possible to work that out. And then obviously inform the teacher, but also inform the student directly. And then the other thing that I think is of great interest in K-12 data and AI type of work is how you use that to improve what you actually provide. So if you're providing curriculum material or you're providing assessment products, you have users, you have data that you collect from those users. Are you improving the quality of those assessment items, for example? How do you know that? So in our example, we'll say, well, the research will tell us there are particularly best ways of teaching a child how to add two fractions together, but that's a set of expert opinions. And so we've always said, let's start with the expert opinions as your kind of hypothesis, and then test them by actually teaching students in different ways and then monitoring the data on how well they understand and use that to then feed back into sort of a learning science feedback loop to say, well, actually, maybe we can teach that more effectively. And our kind of goal is to try and do that at a more central level so that it doesn't just fall on every individual teacher to kind of rethink the whole curriculum all the time. So, I think for us, data at some level of centralization is really powerful. You have to be careful of over-centralizing in education, obviously. But yeah, I think so. That's there's lots of pros and cons to all of that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for the interest. Now, I want this to be fairly dynamic, and so please, jump in with questions for each other or challenges. I might just start with a challenge to Ralph. So I had somebody say to me that much of the machine learning or AI in education at the moment is like a machine learning pig with marketing lipstick, which is a way of saying that there's a lot more said about what machine learning is providing than is the reality. Would you like to give me some of your thoughts on some of the programs that currently are being tried and tested in your space, particularly in testing and measurement in this regard?
Thanks, Dan. So, look, take a step back. And apologies if I'm going to start by taking a step back into a kind of an academic perspective to start with. There's a academic at Monash University, Neil Selwyn, that's very good around this. He talks about some of the unstated assumptions that we bring to this field of education technology in general. I think they're particularly pertinent to the use of AI. One of the unstated assumptions that he talks about is he calls technological determinism. So this is the idea that we as human beings, as teachers and learners working in this space, are somehow kind of bystanders to a process that's happening with technology that is inevitable and some sort of natural force in the world. And what this leads to is sort of two problems. Firstly, it suggests that the technology that's coming in is kind of neutral, and it comes from some other space than designers, than human designers. But it also suggests somehow that our role is kind of as a bystander is to take what we're given and do the best that we can with it. So in this kind of sense, that education is kind of old and failing, and 19th century industrial, and technology is new and shiny and the future. And our job is to take the technology and do with it what the best that we can. And when I look at some of the AI that's coming into this space, I see a lot of technological determinism. Start with the idea that we've got the technology, and then say, well, how will we make the best of it? How will we use it? And for me, what that reveals is a core lack of understanding and interest in notions of learning, improvement, learner-centered approaches. All of these might be what you call the lipstick on the pig. There's a lot of marketing language out there about learner-centered and individualized approaches and so on. But when I look at a lot of these systems, what I really see is something that was already designed, a technology that already existed, that someone already owns, and which someone says, let's see if we can make some money, not to put too fine a point on it, in bringing it into education, because isn't there a lot of money in education? And I think that it constantly reveals itself in the way that we see these AI applications being used, and the directions in which they're heading. So I don't know if you want me to single out a few, but perhaps some others on the panel might. But that's really, I suppose, where my perspective on this is that I think that we need to, as educators, and as human beings, we need to start with the idea that we are not somehow outside this process, but ought to be actually directing this process. And I see a lot of that not happening. And AI, I think, is a great example.
So are there any examples from anyone on the panel of great uses of machine learning? We'll leave the AI bit to the threshold between those two fairly low, but particularly Colin, you've been involved in looking at what best practices look like. What have you seen? You're on mute, mate.
There's a few points that I think I'd like to bring together there, that each of the panel brought up. I think with Ralph, certainly the key is that classrooms are very human. Teachers and kids, and the other point that I think is interesting, we often talk about a lack of data, which we've sort of started to hint towards here, and the sort of the kind of misconception there, although it's factually correct, classrooms are loaded with data, right? I mean, there are false positives and emotional signals and all sorts coming at teachers every minute of every day. And one of the challenges is that I think if you try and get that black box that Rowan talked about, and you try and sort of do some mystic magic and throw a solution in front of them, then all of a sudden there's a lot of questions around that. Like, hang on a minute, well, but I've just been here for the last hour, and I've just been working with these kids for the last year. And, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I think a lot of systems or vendors and products face, is that they forget that, when we look at assessment, I mean, there's looking over the shoulder, there's listening in on those conversations that happen on the table, there's the student work. I mean, these have been forever, so many of those data sets, obviously unstructured, but they're the data sets that inform what teachers do. So one of the real challenges, and why we might see a lot of lipstick on those pigs, is that I think you've really got to meet teachers on those terms and on their terms, where they're very much surrounded by data of 20 to 40, depending on where you are in the world, kids feeding back to them And obviously, if you're in a higher ed context, perhaps hundreds of people sitting in front of you. So I think the data needs to be very humanistic. It needs to be absolutely there to help that human or humans do something different. And I think that's where we see the best uses. And for us, our successes are when teachers say, I did something different because I looked at your dashboard, or I did something different because I noticed that what you've shown me reinforced what I thought I already knew, or it's clarified what I wasn't sure of, or shows me that thing that I thought I did really well actually has, some real impact. So I think for me, there's sort of picking up on a few points there. There's a lot of data in classrooms, and we as the industry have got to be very conscious of those things, because they've informed the practice forever, certainly for a career-long teacher. And we need to really understand that it is a very human-centric environment, and that we've got to not have the black box of magic, I think. So, I mean, there's some of the probably observations and comments on what's been said rather than examples of great data. But I would say that for me, what drives us is the best data is the data that has an impact on the humans. And if something changes as a result, then that's hopefully in a positive way, then that's a result.
So I think there's a great similarity between what you and Ralph were saying in terms of the being careful not to be deterministic and being careful to be supportive of the people who are there. And Colin, you were referencing often formative information. There's another kind of overriding set of more summative information that Rowan, that your products actually show longer term trends and those sorts of things. You talked about impacting teachers. How does the tools that you have at hand help that to happen?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dan. Look, we're all taking a step back and trying to contextualize the question in the way that we want to. Both Ralph and Colin sort of talking about the same thing, and I tend to think about, I tried to frame it in a different way slightly at the top, was that, having a hypothesis. What is it that we expect, the end user, the classroom teacher, the student, whomever is the beneficiary of this work around data and working with it in some way? What change do we want to see? And if you can't articulate that, what is the why? Why would we do this? Then it's overhead, or you've got that lipstick out and you're trying to retrofit some cool thing and find a way to productize it. So the way that we try to think about these things, we set some sort of hurdles for ourselves when we're looking at what we're designing. Everybody, on this call at least, and everyone in K-12 education knows that teacher time is precious. So when we're designing things, we're not looking to have them create, additional work, additional activity in order for us to be able to do something with it. We want to be able to, in the best case, give them time back. So if we can save them from having to do some collation, if we can save them from having to do the kinds of calculations or interpretations of some data we know they commonly do, and that we constantly check with our schools, and we can, here's this thing we know you're looking for, and here it is in this place where you're always working. We tend to try to find those opportunities, the insights that are derived from all of that work, but not making teachers do any of that work. So another hurdle for us is timeliness. We've made it our mission to really closely understand, what we call kind of decision cadence, or just the typical cadences in a school, the points in the year where there's really typical kinds of decisions and information requirements. Reporting is a really big one. Your NAPLAN results are available. You do PAT testing, your PAT test results are available. And we know there are, a series of activities that schools will go through in order to derive some meaning and then plan out some actions. And, you know, they have objectives in mind, and we work with schools really closely to kind of get to that end point and say, well, okay, rather than do all of that, you know, several weeks of work, here it is, half an hour after you've received that information. And not only that, you know, there are comparatives to other types of data. So doing all of that non-trivial, very manual legwork. I mean, that's the biggest thing for us. I know it's not super sexy AI, but it's massively necessary.
Dan, can I jump in and challenge Rowan on something on that? Rowan, that sounds great, but how can you tell the difference between what you've just described and just a normal commercial practice of identifying pain points in order to find ways to generate income out of your clients? And I'll give you an example that picks up on one aspect of what you said of a product, which is nothing to do with anything that anyone on the panel does. So just to keep it a bit neutral, but related. One of the very successful, and I mean successful in commercial terms, applications of machine learning in K-12 is the use of technology to mark roles and monitor the presence of students and non-students in schools. This is taking off at an extraordinary rate, particularly in the US. Big money involved. There are a number of others that people might want to talk about as well that include, for example, monitoring students' online activities, et cetera, et cetera. So this technology absolutely comes straight out of military security prison contexts, and it is used in schools. And the argument is this will save teachers precious time. And the result of that is that you now have technologies in schools which facial recognition monitor students at all times in order to find out who's there, what they're doing, where they're moving, where they're not moving, in order to do what? I don't know. It's a bit creepy, it's a bit scary, and the argument is it'll save you time and you can concentrate on teaching and learning.
Wow. Frightening that you've made the connection with what I've said to that.
Well, I've deliberately given an example which is not to do with the work that you do or anyone else on the panel, but it's the example of we found a pain point, save teachers time, let them concentrate on teaching and learning. The result is a product which is, in my mind, both unethical, bit creepy, and very scary. And nonetheless successful because there are companies out there making lots of money out of it and lots of demand from schools.
Yeah. So I know I emphasized time saving. So firstly, let's address that. It can't be the number one determining factor for why you should do something. There needs to be an actual educational reason. So putting that to one side, the other thing that, and no doubt we'll talk about these with the later questions that Dan's posed for us, but we feel strongly that we should collect only the information that we need to do that one job, which is aligned with the hypothesis. We want to be able to provide teachers a clear indication in a student's performance where it has changed in some way, whether it's negative or positive, and to what we could attribute that potentially. We don't want, that's just an example, we don't want to collect any information that does not align with that exact purpose. And the information we collect, the purpose behind the activity, and any impost on any actors, we make all of that very clear. The example that you just given, I think we're all in some furious agreement here that there is a great deal of data that's being collected for a purpose potentially other than what's stated on the box or could be put to some other use. So I know that's not answering your question, because like you say, it does appear to be doing that job of saving time, and it's probably also rendering some accurate roles or some attendance information. I guess where the difference I'm making is in, firstly, no additional data to be collected, clear purpose towards data capture and the intended outcome. So what is it that we're doing with it? And that's it. And then the second is, well, two things. If we're not delivering on what it is that we've agreed that we're delivering on with our schools, then they no longer pay us money. So there is a commercial imperative there. And I know that you've hinted at that as well. That's clearly a factor for us. But the other is that, we take very seriously working with our schools to make sure that we evolve what it is that we do, because, well, it is good for that commercial factor, but it's also, what we're all passionate about. I'm also an ex-teacher. So, that wasn't the perfect answer to your question, but I got to talk about some cool stuff.
Oh, I was going to jump in and get Richard's view on what he's seeing as some of the best stuff. As after here, we're going to ask some more challenging questions, like Ralph, you did, as to the big. So, tell me, are there things you've seen that you like?
I mean, I'm not necessarily the best person to ask that question. I have gotten increasingly cynical over the last 13 years in the field, I guess. I think there's this really, a few people have said it here. Now, what is the point? What is the purpose of the data? And I think that's the ultimate question. And it's interesting. This is titled an industry panel's view on data in K-12. A lot of people, in the industry that is in EdTech broadly, are in EdTech for the tech, not for the ed, right? And I think there's a really interesting, so some of the places I've seen this happen best, and it's not even entirely clear, what the data kind of hypothesis is necessarily, but there's a big movement happening in Southeast Asia at the moment, and I think it started out of South Korea originally, around the framing of high tech, high touch, right? Which is an idea that education does need improvement because it needs outcome improvement. Right? I think, if you're in Australia and you want to look at maths results, which is what we do all the time, you can try and argue we don't need to improve, and some people do, but we definitely need to improve. That's true around the world. It's true in developing nations around rates of literacy and numeracy, some of which are, my home continent is Africa, and it's just crazy, right? And so when you talk about improvement to education, that's important. I think the best kind of mix I'm seeing at the moment is where people say, well, we can't just let a tech company come in and say they'll fix education because, possibly present company excluded, they don't tend to have the background. They don't tend to know, even, Rowan, you talked about cadence, right? Cadence is super important in a school environment. Stuff happens at different times, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. But there is a whole kind of process flow that being a teacher is, and that schools have compliance requirements around that and so on. And so this high-tech, high-touch movement is more about saying we cannot simply rely on a human-powered workforce to do all this work by themselves, because there's too much variety in schools. There's too much recognition that, deploying the same techniques we had 200 years ago don't work in the preparations we need for now. We could argue that. Maybe people disagree with that. But that you can't also just do that with technology. And so it's this mix of saying, so there was a study, so we just did some work in Cambodia. There's some work that was done, I think in Brazil with, I want to say McGraw-Hill last year and the UN, looking around, how do you actually get the role of the teacher and the data that they need, and practically, not from a product lens as such necessarily, but from a behavior change lens, get that to work in ways that improve student outcomes, in ways that reduce teacher burnout. And the process of that is really interesting because it's not a classic UX design process from a product lens, but it's also not a purely teacher PD lens or professional development lens. It actually involves having, heads of product sitting in classrooms, which I'm sure a bunch of us already do, but, thinking through impacts and thinking through places where, in fact, you don't want the technology. Right? No, actually, we're not going to use it in this part of the workflow. And then you get massive amounts of data that is both qualitative and quantitative, and you get sensible processes at the end that allow you to maximize the use of that data. I think, and so therefore I think the best versions are where people have explicitly accepted that education, particularly education reform or education improvement, is an incredibly complex system that cannot be solved by any single product or any single player in that place. And then you get that really lovely combination of tech and behavior change and behavioral economics and all the other cool stuff we've been working on, as a system over the last 30 years, that sort of on occasion has been rolled out. It takes much longer. It has terrible commercial returns for the first 5 years. And there's some of the reasons it's not done a lot, I suspect. But I think there's a really interesting future play around how industry and non-industry, in the sense of, i.e. bodies that are primarily driven by the need to make rapid commercial returns. Excuse me if I'm offending any of the participants. I also run a commercial entity. And bodies that have longer term, the ability to sometimes to take a longer term view, like research organizations or NGOs, who can say, well, actually, yes, the fact that it takes 5 years to get a result on this is okay, because we recognize that's how long it might take for us to see real impact from using technology in schools, data in schools. And so I think that sort of sense of using the long term, doing it in ways that's really, in our Cambodian project, we didn't even lead it. We're the primary provider of the technology, the infrastructure and the data. And what happened was not our choice. We worked with local partners and teachers, and they did awesome things, which is really cool. So yeah, anyway, I think I'm happy that I can talk about for days. I'm a sharp now.
No problem. I was going to say that Rowan has put a message, a question into the chat, which I think you just answered, and I might try to paraphrase, because he's asking, are we trying to some theories on how students learn in K-12 are usually based on cognitive theories. Is the goal here, in the sense, to develop new theories using the tools? And I think what you're saying is probably not. It's actually more, actually supporting the implementation, from the coalface up. And it seems that what's interesting from this group of panelists is saying we've got to kind of be a bit more pragmatic about supporting what's in place. We're not necessarily about believing or seeing massive changes through the development of some new theories. It's about practically supporting what's going on the ground in a more sort of coherent way.
Can I give you a really quick example of that? So cognitive load theory, for example, will tell us that things like spaced practice and spaced repetition, which is slightly different, are really important in the retention of learning, broadly speaking, for adults and children and everybody. How that is deployed into a classroom is a really interesting question. And it turns out one that for all the tech, we've all deployed into classes, we actually don't have a solid answer to. One of the key questions is how far apart should the spacing be between seeing a new concept? And so groups like Duolingo have spent millions and millions on this research, which is great, and they should do that. And it's actually not broadly particularly well studied or particularly well known at the moment. There's a bunch of research work being done in the US around that. But I think that's a really great example of where we could actually be using data in K-12 classrooms to effectively advance a broader set of knowledge around, well, should I revisit the content every 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 months? And again, every teacher has an opinion. I had an opinion on this when I was teaching. I'm not sure what my opinion was based on what I learned at university, probably. And that information can be updated. And again, updated from a research and pre-teacher education point of view by using data that comes out of actual kids in actual classes, and then fed back into that kind of broader system loop to say, well, actually, we now know that, I don't know, revisiting a maths concept every 3 weeks for 10 minutes is optimal. I don't know that, but I think that's where, that kind of loop can close.
Does anyone want to follow that up, Colin?
I think there's a couple of important things that have sort of been touched on there, and certainly Ralph, your comment to Rowan as well, touches on this, is that I think there's a difference between AI and learning or data in learning, and use the Duolingo example, and that there are companies that are huge and that have sort of spent millions and millions and millions on trying to refine some of these theories and concepts and use technology to improve them. But then I also think that schools are a very specific construct, and that actually, unfortunately, in 20 years in this space, and beginning in the UK and doing a lot of work in Singapore and Hong Kong, and then finally resting in Australia and the US. But schools are not innovative environments, and they largely can't be. Some are, and some do some amazing work. But largely, certainly systemic schools are driven by government policy and huge employment contracts and whatever else. So when we look at the interconnect between that construct and the finance that comes into industry for funding and growth and everything else, I don't think those two organizations are thinking about impact on learning as much as they're thinking about return on investment, as you said, Ralph. We could talk about some of the largest learning communities on the planet and how they've, had whole entire communities in countries use these tools for years, but we've not got any better. And they've become huge because lots of people use them. Edmodo is something that I would pull out from, over a decade ago. It was bigger than Facebook at one point. And why? Because millions and tens of millions of people used it. So tens of millions of dollars got thrown into it. Why? Because people used it, not because it improved learning or because it improved student engagement or anything else, but it was bought because people gravitated towards using it. And that might be the lipstick marketing that's driving the industry to use these things. But I've had a few companies over my 20 years. The one I'm with now, we are self-funded and we go at our own pace. And when people say, why haven't you grown faster? Well, I haven't got it right yet. We haven't mastered what we're trying to achieve. And as we continue to get better and better, yes, we grow as a business. But if the intention for the business was to get bums on seats and get monthly active users and get people, then you could grow very quick. And we've seen that in so many edtech businesses out there. And I think, Ralph, you and I started a discussion about this a while ago, where the drivers in edtech, the commercial drivers, and I think all of a sudden, I remember going to the US in 2015, and we would drive around California, and we could go to a different school district every day, and we could sit with the superintendent and talk about our innovations. I think every year there was another 1,500 venture-funded edtechs that started in California, and there are only 600 school districts. So fast forward to 2022, you cannot pick up the phone to any school district in California and get traction, because 6,000 people who have got tens of millions of dollars in the bank have been throwing their message at these guys for the last 5 or 6 years. And that marketing lipstick is winning because it's what's driving. Now, if you add into that the government piece, which is about, I've got to save teachers time because we've got an EBA, and ironically, the governments are often the ones throwing all the work and everything at the teachers. So you've got this incredibly complex environment there that, unfortunately, having a very real conversation about, wouldn't it be good if we all put our heads together and worked out how to use technology to improve the impact of teaching and learning, or learning generally if it's outside? I don't know that those conversations are as sexy as the ones that are driven by both government policy and the venture capital and private equity businesses who are trying to grow an industry.
Yeah. So that's really got an interesting, implication, because in some of these industries, people say that they are a winner takes all kind of environment, where when it comes to data and AI, i.e. the most successful will get the more data, which will mean that they have better algorithms, which means that they'll have more users, which means they'll get more data, and so on in that reinforcing cycle. Do you see that as being something that is likely in K-12? Anyone?
I'll have a go, Dan, at an aspect of it. I think everything that we've been talking about in the last few minutes actually speaks to another one of these unstated assumptions that we have, which Neil Selwyn calls technological solutionism. So this is the idea that we find a problem. Richard mentioned one before. There's a problem with maths learning outcomes in this country. And then what we do is we apply a ready-made or new technological solution to it. And increasingly that's, framed in the context of the use of large data sets, particularly in the current context. There's a real problem, because what we're looking at in terms of in education, the problems that we're looking at are incredibly complex, socially, economically, politically, historically framed problems. And the solutions that we are, mostly existing solutions that we're applying are engineering solutions, already engineered solutions in many cases. And there's a total mismatch. And I'll just give you a simple example of it. I'm in a school in year 7 or year 8, and my problem is that there's a whole lot of kids who are in my maths class who are way behind where they should be, and a few kids that are way ahead, and I don't know how to teach them because of this, because they're everywhere, and the curriculum says I have to deliver this thing, which is in the middle somewhere. It's going to miss everyone. And so, okay, well, we've got a problem. Let's have a solution. Let's get a bit of software that can manage the needs of 20 kids simultaneously. Problem solved. But let's step back a little bit. Where did this problem come from? There's a lovely cartoon in the paper today, if you're in Melbourne or Sydney, which is titled "Dream the Impossible Dream." And the first dream is to improve literacy and numeracy of our children while continuing to underfund public education. So,
yes.
Where is this problem coming from? It did not, it came from multiple sources. One of the most obvious sources is it comes from, a historic length of time where we have not funded public education. Now let's solve that problem by what? Giving some teachers access to some software. That doesn't seem to me, that smacks of technological solutionism. And I think that there's a lot of appetite for this, because the problems are really much more complex than they appear.
So
can I agree with, as a person who built a technological solution to exactly that problem? Can I actually 100% agree with you on that? And the reason for that is, so when we first built Maths Pathway, that's exactly what it was. It was exactly a technological solution to the problem we had as teachers in the classroom. We were like, hey, if only we could somehow not teach all the kids the same thing based on their age level, right? And the kind of great irony of it was that it took us 6 years to eventually work out that was not actually the solution to the problem. And the reason that Maths Pathway, and I'm super keen on Colin's comments about, the way you build the business and the way you think about growth and improvements. The reason Maths Pathway is not that big, on a kind of sense of scale, is that we discovered how many more things you actually need to happen in a school for effective learning to happen effectively. And then you start to discover how many things should happen systematically. And obviously you have your own locus of control, right, at any one point. But for us, it was saying, well, actually, it turns out, we need teachers to have a better understanding of pedagogical knowledge in mathematics. Well, how do we do that? We're not a university. Okay, well, let's partner. Let's build some courses. Let's do something. Now, I will be the first to tell you, it is not the most optimal way of doing this. It would be much better if we could go back to, some of the original curriculum drawing board stuff, for example, and talk about, how is this structured and sequenced? How is it funded? How are teachers trained? And what are their ongoing, access to professional development? And how does that structure? I think one of the great thing is where, the sad part is when it falls to industry to attempt micro solutions to macro systemic problems. I think there's a great benefit in the fact that clearly everyone here is trying really hard to understand that there is a bigger systemic problem. And I think that's where, I don't know what the next steps from that are. But I think, it's sort of the response to Colin's comment about schools not feeling particularly innovative, in the sense that they are constrained it is in a systemic sense. Obviously, some schools are very independent by the systems in which they have to work. And we've always seen our view as saying, well, our goal is outcome improvement in mathematics. will build and sign and choose whatever tools, be they virtual, physical, training-based, human-based, we need to do that. Now, it'd be nice if someone would pour billions of dollars into us to help do that. But equally, I've often made the case, I would quite happily take everything we do and say to the government, assuming that an appropriate sector could be trusted to run this, actually, guys, this is your job. You are the Department of Education. I would love to see the work we do in your world. And I would happily then step back and go away. So I think that's, just to call out the elephant, that is what Maths Pathway was built to try and solve in that way. And I still don't think it's the best way to do it. It's the best way I think we have in the system without getting better systemic help around it. I like at least that the new curriculums don't say you have to teach the same thing to the same kid at the same time. That is helpful. But that's also not true elsewhere in the world. There are places in the world where they're saying that more than they used to.
The important piece as well is there is such a massive disconnect when we talk about EdTech. And I think if you look at the disproportionate investment in EdTech, you might get a government saying we're going to spend $10 million on software for schools. And that same government might be spending 150 million on, with Salesforce to build out a database. And you're like, well, hang on, are we both in EdTech here? Because one, you could take most of the Victorian EdTech industry, give them 150 million and go and innovate for the next decade and probably solve a heap of classroom problems and school problems. Well, building a database, that's not EdTech. And I think to your point, Ralph, that's a system that was built for supporting salespeople and is now all of a sudden running schools. It's, I think EdTech is sometimes got such a broad brush attached to it that, we aren't focusing on some of the problems, and we're not, as back to your original point, Ralph, we're not humanizing them enough. We're not getting into those complex classroom environments and understanding and having those drivers of how to improve learning outcomes in schools. Interactive whiteboards, again, massive. Why was that the biggest company in the world? Because BER, the building education revolution put $34 billion. And do you know what qualified as building schools? Buying whiteboards. Improving learning didn't qualify as building schools. And I've never seen a government put $34 billion into improving learning.
Well, gentlemen,
end of rant.
We have managed it. No, we've got actually a lot of compliments in the chat and a lot of applause from the audience for the kind of things that we're saying. And we've got 3 minutes left on the clock here. Would you be able to give me just one sentence each on where you think ownership in this next world of derived data is going to take us? And I might just start with you, Colin, because you actually have got one of the most improved data sets that I've seen.
I guess we only use our own data. So we, through check-ins with students that teachers initiate, we build a proprietary data set with the schools to draw insights and try and, find the insights that help teachers the most. And I think, I guess, so we're quite unique in the sense that we don't draw on other data sets that are out there. So, however, we do encourage schools to use our data sets with other data sets.
So the issue that I'm highlighting is that's data, the data that you're using is collected from students. And there's that legislation that's coming that's going to try to take control of derived data. Maybe I'll just quickly go around because I've looked at the time, and I'll just go around and say, does anyone have a comment on, ownership of of data sets that are derived from students' interactions or teachers' work?
Dan, just to continue the theme of my comments apparently from this session, if we in education broadly do not learn from the last 10 years of the rise of social media, and the use of data for generating profit, then we're in big trouble, because they're coming for us and we'll be next.
I think that self-interest is a good driver, and I think that's a great way to close the panel. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to all the audience for enjoying, along with me, all of your comments. Thank you.